My name is Susan Parker. I'm 62 years old, and before I retired, I spent almost 27 years working as a grocery store cashier in a small town where everyone seemed to know everyone else. I wasn't a doctor, I wasn't a teacher, I wasn't anyone important, but after standing behind that register for so many years, I learned something about people. Some talk constantly, but never say what they truly feel. Others barely speak at all, yet somehow tell you everything. For 40 years, I believed my husband belonged to the second group. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. Because in all those years together, Edward never once told me he loved me. Not on our wedding day, not when our daughter was born, not after we bought our first little house, not on anniversaries, not even after I survived breast cancer 12 years ago. If you're wondering why I stayed with a man who never said those words, I understand. If someone had told me the same story years ago, I probably would have asked the exact same question. But here's the strange part. Edward wasn't cruel. He wasn't distant. He never raised his voice at me. He never forgot my birthday. Every morning before I woke up, there was already a fresh cup of coffee waiting on the kitchen table, exactly the way I liked it. 1 spoonful of sugar, just a splash of cream. When winter came, he cleaned the snow off my car before I even looked outside. If something broke around the house, it was fixed before I had the chance to mention it. When my feet hurt after a long shift at the store, he'd quietly place a heating pad on the couch without saying a word. To everyone around us, we looked like one of those couples people secretly admired, the kind that had somehow figured out how to stay happily married for decades. What nobody knew was that there were 3 words I had spent 40 years waiting to hear. I love you. At first, I thought he was simply shy. Then I convinced myself that maybe he had trouble expressing emotions. After 10 years, I stopped expecting it. After 20, I stopped asking. Or at least, I pretended I had. Every now and then, I'd test him. I'd smile before leaving the house and say, "Love you." He'd smile back. Then answer with something completely different. "Drive safely," or "Looks like it's going to rain later." Sometimes, "Don't forget your sweater." Never, "I love you too." Not once. Friends used to tell me how lucky I was. You found one of the good ones. And they weren't wrong. Edward was dependable, honest, patient. The kind of man who'd stop to help a stranger change a flat tire without thinking twice. But every time someone called us the perfect couple, I felt something tighten inside my chest. Because perfect couples don't leave each other wondering, do they? When I turned 62 and finally retired, everything changed. For the first time in our marriage, we were together almost every day. There was no work to distract me, no customers, no busy schedule, just the 2 of us, and a silence I could no longer ignore. One warm October evening, we were sitting on our back porch. Edward was repairing an old wooden lantern he'd refused to throw away for years. I watched him sanding the cracked wood with the same patience he seemed to have for everything in life. Then a thought crossed my mind. If I didn't ask now, I might never ask at all. I looked at him and quietly said, "Edward, can I ask you something?" He didn't look up. Of course. My heart was pounding so hard I could actually hear it. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in 40 years, I asked the question I'd been carrying for almost my entire marriage. Did you ever love me? The sandpaper stopped moving. His hands froze. A few seconds later, the old lantern slipped from his fingers and hit the wooden porch floor with a dull crack. But Edward still didn't answer. Edward stared at the broken lantern on the porch floor for what felt like an eternity. I had imagined this moment hundreds of times over the years. I thought maybe he'd laugh and say, "Of course I do." Or maybe he'd look surprised that I had even asked. Instead, he looked terrified. Not angry, not offended, terrified. Without saying a word, he bent down, picked up the lantern, and carefully brushed the dust from the cracked glass. His hands were shaking. I had never seen them shake before. Finally, he whispered, "Susan." Then he stopped. The silence between us felt heavier than anything either of us could have said. I waited. He looked at me, opened his mouth, and then quietly stood up. "I'm going to put this in the garage." That was it. He walked away, leaving me sitting there with 40 years of unanswered questions. That night, neither of us slept much. Edward lay beside me, staring at the ceiling. I could hear him turning over every half hour. Normally, he'd fall asleep within minutes. Not that night. I wanted to ask again. I wanted to shake him awake and demand an answer. But something stopped me. For the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. The next morning, everything looked normal. Too normal. He made coffee, fried eggs, asked if I wanted toast, as if nothing had happened. I watched him move around the kitchen. How could someone pretend so easily? Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Edward." He looked up. "You never answered me." He lowered his eyes to his coffee mug. "I know." I waited. "So?" He took a slow sip. "I don't know how." At first, I thought I had misunderstood him. "Don't know how what?" "Answer." That confused me even more. "You've had 40 years." "I know." "Then why can't you answer now?" He rubbed both hands together, something he only did when he was nervous. "I just can't." Those 3 words hurt more than if he'd simply said no. For the rest of the day, the house felt different. Not louder, not quieter, just unfamiliar. It was as if I had suddenly realized I'd been living with someone I didn't fully know. That afternoon, my daughter Emily called. She could hear something was wrong almost immediately. "Mom, are you okay?" I almost told her. I almost said, "Did you know your father has never told me he loves me?" But I didn't. Instead, I lied. "I'm just tired." She believed me, or maybe she pretended to. That evening, I found myself wandering through the hallway closet looking for absolutely nothing. That's when I noticed an old cardboard box on the top shelf. It was covered in dust. I had seen it dozens of times over the years, but had never opened it. I climbed onto a chair and carefully pulled it down. Inside were old photo albums, receipts, warranty papers, and dozens of birthday cards. Every birthday card I had ever given Edward. Every anniversary card. Every Christmas card, every Valentine's Day card. He had kept every single one, 40 years worth. I smiled for a moment. Then I opened one. Inside, in my own handwriting, I had written, "No matter what happens, I'll never stop telling you that I love you." The card had been signed 32 years earlier. Edward had folded it neatly and tucked it away like it was something precious. One after another, I opened more cards. Every single one had been carefully preserved. Not a single crease, not a stain, nothing. It looked as though he had protected them more carefully than our wedding photographs. Then something caught my attention. At the bottom of one box, there was a small envelope. It wasn't addressed to me, it wasn't stamped, and in Edward's handwriting were just 4 words: "Do not throw away." I stared at it for a long time. For reasons I couldn't explain, I suddenly felt that whatever was inside that envelope had something to do with the question he couldn't answer. My hands were trembling as I picked up the envelope. I knew I shouldn't open it. It wasn't addressed to me. Edward had never hidden things from me before, at least, not that I knew of. But after 40 years of wondering whether my own husband had ever truly loved me, it didn't feel like I was invading his privacy. It felt like I was searching for the truth. I carefully opened the flap. Inside, there wasn't a letter. There were only a few folded pieces of paper. The first one was yellow with age. It looked like it had been written decades earlier. Across the top, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Things a man should never say." I frowned. What kind of list was this? I unfolded it completely. The first line read, "Never complain about pain." The second, "Never cry in front of your family." The third, "A man's job is to provide, not to talk about feelings." I kept reading. "Your wife should know you love her," without hearing the words. I stopped breathing for a moment. At the bottom of the page was a signature, Frank Parker, Edward's father. I had met Frank many times over the years. He wasn't a bad man, just quiet, very quiet. The kind of father who shook your hand instead of hugging you. The kind of grandfather who showed up with gifts but never said he was proud of anyone. I had never thought much about it, until now. There were more pages. Some were handwritten notes. Others looked like old journal entries. One sentence had been underlined so many times that the paper had nearly torn. "Words make a man weak. Actions are all that matter." I leaned back in my chair. Suddenly, memories I hadn't thought about in years started returning. Whenever Edward fixed something around the house, his father would nod in approval. Whenever Edward thanked someone, his father stayed silent. Whenever I hugged Edward in front of Frank, his father would look away. I remembered thinking it was strange. Now it felt heartbreaking. That evening, Edward came home from the hardware store carrying a small paper bag. He smiled when he saw me in the kitchen. "I picked up those cinnamon rolls you like." Normally, I would have smiled back. This time, I couldn't. I held up the folded papers. His face lost every bit of color. "You opened the envelope." It wasn't a question. "No," I answered quietly. "I opened 40 years of silence." He closed his eyes. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he sat down across from me. "I was hoping you'd never find those." "Why?" "Because I didn't want you to know what kind of home I grew up in." I looked at the papers again. Edward, did your father really teach you that saying I love you made a man weak? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared out the kitchen window. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. The first time I ever told my father I loved him, I was 8 years old. I felt my chest tighten. He looked at me and said, Edward swallowed hard, "Little boys say things like that. Real men don't." The room fell silent. I never said it again. For the first time in 40 years, I wasn't looking at my husband. I was looking at the frightened little boy he had once been. And for the first time, I realized my question hadn't hurt him because he didn't love me. It had hurt him because he had spent his entire life believing that saying those words would make him less of a man. Still, one question remained. If he had loved me all those years, why had he never tried to break free from the lesson that had haunted him since childhood? I looked him in the eyes and quietly asked, Edward, after 40 years with me, wasn't I worth unlearning that? Edward didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, turning his wedding ring slowly with his thumb. I'd seen him do that before, usually when he was worried about money, or when one of the kids was sick. Never because of me. Finally, he looked up. I've asked myself that question more times than you could ever imagine. His voice was calm, but I could hear it breaking underneath. I wanted to say it, Susan. More than once. Then why didn't you? He let out a long breath. Because every single time the words reached my throat, I heard my father's voice. I didn't interrupt him. For the first time in our marriage, Edward was finally talking. When we were first married, I remember standing behind you in our first apartment while you were washing dishes. You were humming that old Elvis song you liked. I almost said it. I even whispered the first 2 words. He smiled sadly. But then I remembered my father telling me that love wasn't something a man talked about. So instead, I asked if the water was too hot. I closed my eyes. I remembered that evening. I remembered laughing and telling him the sink was fine. I had no idea what had almost happened. Edward continued, Do you remember when Emily was born? Of course I do. I held both of you in that hospital room. I looked at you, and I wanted to tell you I loved you more than anything in this world. His eyes filled with tears. But my father was standing behind me. I froze. I heard him clear his throat. Just one sound. That was enough. I shook the doctor's hand instead. I thanked the nurses. I carried the flowers. And I never said what I wanted to say. I covered my mouth. That day had always hurt me. I remembered lying in that hospital bed, exhausted, wondering why my husband looked so distant after becoming a father. For 40 years, I had misunderstood that memory. Edward stood up and walked toward the living room. A minute later, he returned carrying an old wooden box. I had never seen it before. He placed it carefully on the kitchen table. I should have shown you this years ago. Inside were dozens of small notebooks. The oldest one was worn almost white around the edges. I opened the first page. The date read, May 14th, 1985, the day after our wedding. The first sentence made my heart stop. Susan laughed today because I burned the pancakes. I've never seen anyone more beautiful. I turned another page. She fell asleep on the couch tonight. I wanted to tell her I loved her. I couldn't. Another page. Our first anniversary. Bought her roses. Still couldn't say it. Another. She cried after losing her mother today. Held her for almost an hour. I hope she felt what I couldn't say. The pages became blurry through my tears. There were thousands of entries, tiny moments, ordinary days, 40 years of a man writing the words he couldn't speak. I love Susan. I love my wife. I hope she knows. Again and again and again. I looked at him across the table. You wrote this instead of telling me? He nodded. It was the only place where I wasn't afraid. I gently closed the notebook. Part of me wanted to be angry. Another part wanted to cry for the young man who had spent his entire life fighting a voice that wasn't his own. But one question still wouldn't leave my mind. If you knew how much this mattered to me, I whispered, why didn't you let me read these? Edward looked at the notebooks for a long time before answering. His fingers rested on the cover of the oldest one, as if it were something fragile. Then he quietly said, because I was ashamed. I frowned. Ashamed of loving me? He shook his head. No. Ashamed that after 40 years, writing the words was still easier than saying them? His voice cracked for the first time since we'd started talking. I kept telling myself I'd say it tomorrow, then next week, on our anniversary, on Christmas, after your birthday. There was always another chance. He looked down, and after a while, I stopped believing I could. That night we stayed at the kitchen table for hours, not arguing, just talking, really talking, maybe for the first time in our marriage. I asked him questions I'd never dared ask before. He answered every single one, sometimes immediately, sometimes after long silences. Then I asked something that had been haunting me. Did you ever think I didn't notice? He gave a sad smile. I hoped you wouldn't. But deep down, I knew. I saw it every time you looked at me after saying I love you. I saw you waiting. And every time, I disappointed you. I felt tears rolling down my cheeks. You did. I know. But I also knew something else. What? You never stopped saying it. That caught me off guard. He smiled through watery eyes. 40 years, Susan. You never gave up. You kept saying those 3 words even when I never answered. I don't think I ever thanked you for that. A week passed. Life slowly settled into a new rhythm. Nothing looked different. We still drank coffee together every morning. We still walked around the neighborhood every evening. We still argued over whose turn it was to water the tomatoes. But something had changed. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt honest. Edward was trying. Not with grand speeches. That wasn't who he was. Instead, he started doing something I'd never seen before. He'd stop in the middle of a conversation, look at me, as if he wanted to say something. Sometimes he'd even open his mouth. Then he'd smile awkwardly and look away. I could see the battle happening inside him every single day. One afternoon, while we were planting flowers in the backyard, he suddenly said, "Susan." I looked up. He froze. His hands tightened around the small shovel. For a second, I thought, this is it. But instead, he laughed nervously. I forgot what I was going to say. I knew he hadn't. I simply reached over and squeezed his hand. "It's okay." He nodded. But I could see the disappointment in his eyes. Not mine, his. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of disappointing me. He was afraid of disappointing himself. A few days later, our daughter Emily invited us over for Sunday dinner. The whole family was there. Our grandchildren were running through the house, laughing so loudly that nobody could hear the television. At one point, Emily's youngest son climbed into Edward's lap. "Dad," Emily said from the kitchen, "can you tell Noah what you always tell me before I drive home?" Edward smiled. "Always wear your seatbelt." Emily laughed. "And?" He thought for a moment. "Drive carefully." She shook her head. "No, Dad. The other thing." Edward looked confused. Emily walked over and kissed him on the cheek. "You've been saying it for years." Then she turned to me. "Mom, every time I leave, Dad tells me he loves me." I felt my heart stop. I slowly looked at Edward. He looked just as shocked as I was. Then he whispered, "I didn't even realize." Emily smiled. "You started saying it after Noah was born. You've never missed a single time." I stared at my husband. The man who believed he couldn't say those words had been saying them to our daughter for years, without even noticing. And in that moment, I realized something neither of us had understood before. That drive home was quieter than usual. Neither of us turned on the radio. Neither of us spoke. I kept replaying Emily's words in my mind. "You've been saying it for years." How was that possible? The man who couldn't tell his own wife he loved her had somehow learned to say it to our daughter. When we pulled into the driveway, I finally broke the silence. "Edward?" He looked at me. "Why Emily?" He rested both hands on the steering wheel before answering. "I don't know." I waited. Then he smiled sadly. Maybe because when she became a mother, I realized how many things I had never heard from my own father. I didn't want Noah to grow up the way I did. And somewhere along the way, I stopped hearing my father's voice. I reached across the seat and took his hand. "So why couldn't you say it to me?" His eyes filled with tears. "Because by then, I had convinced myself it was too late. You had waited 40 years. I thought 3 words could never make up for that." I squeezed his hand tighter. "They couldn't." He lowered his eyes. "I know. But they could start something new." A few evenings later, I was sitting on the front porch with a blanket over my knees, watching the sun disappear behind the maple trees. Edward walked outside carrying 2 mugs of coffee, just like he had done thousands of times before. He handed me my mug and sat beside me. For several minutes, we simply watched the sky change colors. Then he quietly said, "Susan?" His voice sounded different, steadier. I turned toward him. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the horizon. I've spent most of my life believing that love was something you proved with your hands. He looked down at those weathered hands, the roof I repaired, the coffee I made every morning, the snow I shoveled, The flowers I planted because I knew they made you smile. I thought those things spoke loudly enough. He took a slow breath, but I was wrong. I felt my heart pounding. He turned toward me. For the first time in 40 years, there was no fear in his eyes, only peace. He reached for my hand. His fingers were shaking. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said the 3 words I had imagined hearing for almost half my life. I love you, Susan. The world didn't stop. There was no music, no dramatic moment, just the sound of birds settling into the trees and 2 people who had finally stopped hiding from each other. I smiled through my tears. You know, I never stopped hoping. He laughed softly. I know. I'm sorry it took me 40 years. I shook my head. No. It took 40 years for both of us. He looked confused. I smiled. I spent all those years waiting for you to love me in my language. And I almost missed the fact that you'd been loving me in yours all along. He closed his eyes. A single tear rolled down his cheek. I had seen my husband cry only twice before. That evening became the 3rd. It's been almost 2 years since that conversation. Edward still isn't a man of many words. He probably never will be. But now, every morning before I walk into the kitchen, I hear the same quiet voice. Good morning, sweetheart. I love you. Sometimes he still seems surprised that he said it out loud. And every single time, I smile like it's the first. Because I've learned something I wish I'd understood much earlier. Love isn't measured only by the words we hear, or only by the things we do. The strongest marriages happen when we learn to speak each other's language before it's too late.